Hello everyone, welcome to episode 10 of Long Shots, our weekly podcast, and I'm here with Sharad. Hey man, how are you?
I'm very good, and it's good to be here. And happy Diwali to you and everyone who's listening right
Yes,
now.
happy Diwali, happy Diwali. Very, very eventful week outside India,
Yeah,
but fairly quiet because of the festive season here. People busy with their families and friends. So probably the best way to start today's discussion would be to look out, see what's happening in West, in the US.
are you referring to midterm elections?
Yes, I am. It was not very subtle, was it?
No, it wasn't at all.
Right.
But yeah, I was obviously tracking a little bit of it, and it interests to us not just because it's politics, Western politics, but also because it has some implications on the economy and the stock markets, which always ties in well with rest of our thesis around
Yeah, plus I think US is still too big to ignore.
yeah.
So yeah, whatever is happening there has some sort of an implication.
I was listening to a long time back. I was listening to an interview of Shashi Tharoor, and he was jokingly saying that U.S. elections are so important for the rest of the world that every individual should have a vote.
Right. Every individual definitely has an opinion.
Yeah. So that was funny. But let's talk about it. I mean, no major surprises, I would say. You tell me what you feel about it, but seems like Democrats crawl their way in terms of the House of Reps, but the Senate seems to be holding still with the Republican majority, as one would expect, I guess.
Correct. Yeah, I think on the House side, as you mentioned, as expected, but I think they came in fairly strongly. Voter turnout was pretty high. It was, I think, 70%, which is usually pretty high for midterms.
Yeah, that I think might be a record high, at least in the last 5-10 years. I haven't looked it up, but
Probably.
it seems really high.
Yeah, but the Senate did not really swing, and we will discuss that in some time why that was happening. But yeah, but first things first, let's I think talk a bit about midterms, what they really are, because I think they are pretty different from how things work in India or in the Westminster style of setup, right? So midterms are primarily for, I think, three things: the Senate, the House of Representatives, and also governor positions, right? So the Senate and the House of Reps are basically the two houses of the US Parliament, as they call it, Congress.
Yeah, the upper and lower, I guess.
So Senate is the upper and House of Reps is the lower one.
Correct.
Right? And because in the US, the executive, which is basically the president, is completely segregated from the legislature, unlike in India where members of the executive are also members of the House as MPs.
Yeah.
So the executive in the US is actually accountable to the legislature in a much more, I would say on paper, bipartisan way.
Yeah.
And that's why I think these midterms are fairly important, because if the House swings the other way, President Trump will finally have some sort of a check.
Yeah, and given how much of press coverage Donald Trump and his policies generate, it was the first time for him to sort of, defend his positioning or show some kind of endorsement to what he's doing amongst the common electoral process. So it was his chance to sort of blow his trumpet, if you will.
So, but do you think he will now, are there some big things which the House of Representatives can do to kind of irritate Trump now that they have a majority?
I think, let me answer it the other way and tell me what you think about it. But let's say his aggressive moves towards tax cuts and sort of holding back environmental policy acts will now require a lot more thought. Or
Healthcare as well.
Will require a lot more. It won't be as clear cut. They will definitely be pushed around for that. So that, depends on your views if it's positive or negative, but it certainly won't be smooth sailing when he wants to push those
Because I think most of these things will go through Congress, and then there are like this set of congressional hearings, right?
Yes.
So there he will now receive much more pushback on these fairly radical moves.
I think so. In fact, even I was reading somewhere, I can't remember which newspaper it was, but a Western newspaper, obviously, but they were talking about how legalization of marijuana will now take a major push because it's a sort of a democratic leaning agenda as against a Republican. And, things like that. This is just one piece of it.
But there's pressure from up north, right? When it comes to legalization.
There is pressure from up north for sure. So, yeah, let's see. But what do you think about it? And obviously, you were looking at some inferences into the stock markets as well.
Right. Yeah, I was looking at inferences in two things. One was into from an economic perspective, and the other was also Trump himself. I think, he might be more vulnerable to things like his personal tax disclosure now. He might be more vulnerable in terms of, the Russian collusion investigation,
Yeah.
which is like, I think geopolitics at the most boring level. But yeah, I think he might be held more accountable. Economy is very interesting because I was reading somewhere, I think it was in the Wall Street Journals, where it was saying that the S&P 500 hasn't actually declined in the year after midterm elections since 1946. Why do you think that's happening?
That's very interesting. I don't know how to answer that question. I mean, obviously, the big thing to understand here is correlation versus causation.
Right.
I'm guessing there is both, a little bit of both here.
Right.
But it's interesting you point that out. So, do we expect the markets to go up again in near term?
Well, they have climbed by 15% on average every time after midterms historically.
That's very interesting. And has there been a pattern in the midterm elections in terms of opposition versus the incumbents in terms of evening out the field?
Well, that's the beauty of, I think, the US system. I mean, it's not perfect. It's very, I think it is naturally designed to be very, checks and balances heavy and very indecisive, so to say. I mean, I always feel like the Indian Prime Minister or the British Prime Minister are much more powerful within their local realms than the US president, right? But, and one of the big reasons is because in pretty much every midterm in the last, 35, 40 years, the party of the president and the party of the and the party which is dominating the house has always been different.
Okay.
So there's always a natural check on the White House through that.
Maybe that's maybe the stock markets like some sort of political gridlock.
Right.
Maybe they feel that's good for the economy when there is those, as you say, checks and balances in place. Maybe
So
the
that
market,
nothing radical happens.
yeah, I think that sort of market always loves predictability, smoothness,
Right.
less volatility. All these things generally tend to play well with investors, let's call it.
Right.
Maybe when it's evening out, it seems like it's not going to swing one way or the other. Maybe, but I'm just.
But that's very interesting you say that, because I think I can see a parallel to that in the Indian scenario as well. Because in India also there is always this discussion between whether whether a coalition government is stronger and stabler than a government with a significant majority.
Yeah.
And probably pre 1991, everybody used to think that it's better to kind of be in power in an absolute way so that you can be decisive, you can be you can basically fulfill the agenda that you have set during the election season.
Yeah.
But I think power is a deadly cocktail, right? It gets to your head, and then it often leads to erratic actions, right? I think this present government also has a lot of examples on that. And I remember when Vajpayee became PM for the second time, it was economically one of the most stable, good periods.
Yeah.
Right. Because I think because nobody could really get carried away, right? Every time some so-called radical thinking, quote unquote, is brought forward, there will be so much opposition and so much debate and so much discussion that it will actually lead to something better.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of if you leave the markets to how they are performing, if you don't really touch them, I think they prefer that.
Yeah, I can see that. That's probably the only causal link that I can think of. But let's see how this goes. I mean, at the end of the day, I think both the Democrats and Republic are sort of capitalistic leaning in terms of financial policy.
Right.
It's just maybe on the political side, there's different degrees of liberalism,
Right.
for lack of a better word. But so yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying, and I totally agree. And there is definitely inferences in the Indian context as well. I mean, right now, let's see. I mean, we have elections coming up as well, so that's going to be another nice little watch. And although also the time leading up to it right now.
Right, absolutely. Well, moving a bit close to our coasts, you want to talk about RBI and the government? What's going on?
Yeah, on one hand, Democrats and Republicans are in a deadlock, but here there's a different kind of deadlock.
Right.
RBI and the government and the whole emerging theme, which we talked about last week as well, about who has more power or who's playing T20.
Right.
I remember you talked about it.
Right.
But let's talk a little bit about it, and why don't you share some of your views on where do you think it's heading and how good it is?
I actually read this very interesting interview of ex-RBI Governor Bimal Jalan, in which he was saying that if the RBI Governor feels that the autonomy of the institution is under attack, and if there's a lot of acrimony between the government to which the RBI ultimately is answerable to, then he should just resign. I think I think Bimal Jalan was from a fairly different era
Yeah.
where governors were much more, I would say, conservative, not very vocal about their disagreement.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, that's what he was saying, that Urjit Patel should have resigned by now. That's the biggest that's the most, I would say, a high impact way of influencing opinion in favor of the institution.
Yeah, I mean, I can see I can agree to it partially, and I can disagree to it partially as well. But I see what he's trying to say,
Yeah.
and I get what he's trying to say. And yes, I mean,
Because I
resignating.
think before Raghuram Rajan, most of the RBI governors, you would never even hear about them in the press. Most of the time, if you look at Y.V. Reddy, if you look at Subbarao, Vimal Jalan himself, like their statements were usually in the context of monetary policy decisions. They were very, very limited in their outlay
Yeah.
in the public. Whereas I think post Raghuram Rajan, even though I personally really liked him, I still like him. He was much more vocal, and he used to often step outside his usual mandate.
Have you read "I Do What I Do" by Raghuram Rajan?
Yes, I have actually. This was I remember when I was once just reading various speeches that Raghuram Rajan has given throughout his career. And remember that classic speech he gave at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where he pretty much quote unquote predicted the financial crisis.
Yeah, I think the name of the paper was "Has Financial Development Made the World Riskier?"
Yes, absolutely. So when I read that speech, I was really fascinated by knowing that he actually writes most of his speeches himself. And that's when I took this book, which is pretty much a collection of his essays and speeches during the tenure in central bank in India, before that, after that. And in fact, he allocated a fair bit of the book to the topic of inflation.
Okay.
Because it was, I think, during his tenure that flexible inflation targeting was introduced as a framework. I mean, inflation was always a criteria for central bankers in India to increase or decrease interest rates. But it was during Raghuram Rajan's time that it was made an institutional kind of a framework with a particular range which bankers had to target for.
Yeah, no, I recall as well. And like you said, I think you're right. I think he was the first guy who vocally articulated the number as well. I think, like you said, like 6% plus minus 2 when he began in terms of targeting inflation.
So it was 6%, yeah, and then it was 4% plus
And then
minus
yes, and okay, yeah, 6%, and then moved to 4 plus minus 2. But at least he put a number. And I remember when he initially was targeting those inflation numbers, I remember they were consistently hitting those numbers, so it was working.
Yeah, but he was getting a lot of flack at that time because the rates were supposedly quote unquote under an all-time high.
Yeah.
And businesses and the government of the day were kind of pushing back against it. And his logic was, look, I mean, if your rate of return is X, you need to take into account what the effect of inflation is. I mean, it's typical time value of money concept, right? That if you make 10%, but inflation is 8% during the period, you're effectively making just 2%.
Yeah.
So he spent a lot of time, giving seminars, giving speeches, trying to explain that concept to people, how inflation can be such a harmful thing.
Yeah, and I think after Raghuram Rajan, after his 3 years, I mean, Urjit Patel has sort of taken the same premise of actually inflation targeting.
It was actually
being
Urjit Patel's report
that
which
actually
was used by
yes,
Rajan.
yeah.
So they were pretty much, I think, from the same
school
group.
of thought. Yeah, and it's a very Western school of thought, I think, and these guys are all Western educated anyway.
Right.
But it's the same thing that we're going right now. But you and I were discussing about it on, whether inflation targeting at its core, obviously it makes sense, and we're not macroeconomic experts, but there are some views around it as well, which are worthy of talking, I guess, in terms of how inflation matters and, in terms of the whole real versus nominal GDP and the role that inflation plays from a supply and a demand side. What are your thoughts around it, and what is the discussion about?
So the primary discussion is about the fact that obviously inflation eats through one's savings, it eats through one's capacity to pay for products and services. So it is something very important at a fundamental citizen level.
Yeah.
Right. And the flexible inflation targeting mechanism, their idea is that, okay, so we have a designated range, right? It's 4 plus minus 2. So every time, if for 3 quarters consecutively the prices are going up beyond this range, then that calls for a rate hike, right? So usually in that, the counter is given by the government or the businesses that if you're increasing rates, you are putting some sort of a constraint on investment capacity, because borrowing becomes more expensive. So in order to control inflation, you are actually affecting growth. So very quickly this debate becomes a growth versus inflation thing. But obviously these things are fairly complicated and layered. If you look at in price increase itself, price increase can happen because of like classic economics 101. It's because of a demand supply mismatch, but sometimes it is demand driven and sometimes it's supply driven, right? And the impact of increasing or decreasing interest rates are different for whether inflation is driven by a drop in demand an increase in demand, or whether inflation is driven by a drop in supply.
And at the end of the day, it's a demand-supply relationship, right? That sort of drives everything. But let's dig a little deeper, albeit we're sort of getting into complicated areas. But when you talk about supply side and demand side, listen, at the end of the day, I think every businessman, if you ask him what does he want, higher rates or lower rates, would always say lower rates.
Exactly.
Like that's sort of given. But when you talk about supply side and demand side, what factors are we talking about on the supply side? Like
so like on the supply side, it's something like if there's a supply shock, right? If there's like inadequate monsoon, if crude oil prices spike up. I mean, these are things which happen very frequently in the Indian scenario.
Correct.
Right? So that is supply driven inflation. And on demand driven inflation is if the demand has gone sustainable, like above what's the usual status quo. And that's usually a problem which emerging markets don't face at a frequent level. That is a problem for developed economies, as they say. So the main theory is that if there is demand driven inflation, right, targeting it by interest rate increase is okay. It works, because what it does, it basically puts a check on consumption spend. But if it's supply driven, right, inflation, then in that case what happens is that if the rates are going up, then the liquidity of the system goes down, and hence companies, businesses are unable to invest more and actually increase that productivity. So it kind of spirals down further and further.
It's a double whammy then.
Exactly.
So is this a fair statement then, that in the Indian context, the inflationary pressure that you see in the economy is more supply side driven?
I won't really say that. I mean, frankly, I would need to actually see a bit more data to kind of take that call, because I feel India is also a very big consumption market.
Because it's so difficult as it is to sort of segregate demand and supply side pressures on inflation.
Right.
It's a mix of everything, right? And separating it out is not so easy.
Right. Interestingly, there is another school of thought which says that, why are you just looking at inflation? Why don't you look at something like nominal GDP? Because nominal GDP is like basically the combination of real GDP and inflation. So the idea is that, okay, in that, even if it's a supply driven inflation, the inflation will go up, but the real GDP will go down. So the nominal GDP is going to stay pretty much the same. So you won't really have a aggressive monetary policy action to counter that. So there is another school of thought which kind of argues that, okay, leave inflation target as per nominal GDP. So, but I think the thing is that most of the agenda in central banking is set up by Western banks. If you look at like Bank of England historically, then obviously Federal Reserve. So the tendency is, and as you mentioned correctly, like people like Raghuram Rajan, Urjit Patel, they're all from that Western background, right? So they think like that, and they're kind of using that framework in India. There might be something more to that. There is obviously an open debate on that.
No, it's very interesting. I mean, this is slightly complicated terms, which is a macroeconomic specific, but it's always very interesting because how important it is, not just to the economy, but given our interest levels as well on such subjects.
Right.
It's definitely a very...
interest level and the very
wordplay there.
Very, very, very clever, Sharan. Very clever.
Wordplay there. No, we should obviously keep in. I mean, it's not any material event that's going to unfold, but it's definitely a very healthy debate to observe and closely analyze, I guess.
Yeah, I think the next physical meeting between the Finance Ministry and RBI is going to happen on November 19th. So it'll be fascinating to see how this pans out. And I mean, there are still like almost like 10 days plus between that date and today. So I'll be watching this news fairly keenly.
No, that's great. And do you want to move on to something lighter, I guess?
Yes.
From politics to elections to gaming companies?
Yes, I think that would be an appropriate segue, as you say.
Yeah, no, I found it interesting. It's an industry that we rarely talk about, although it's such a big one. It's the video game industry.
Correct.
And I think we were both talking about this game called Fortnite, which has become really popular amongst, let's call it, the younger demographic. It's by Epic Games, and they recently raised 1.25 billion in funding, which I think is estimated drives an estimated valuation of 15 billion for Epic Games,
Right.
which is massive. And
So Epic Games, I mean, since you pointed out that this appeals to younger lot, isn't Epic Games the same company which made Unreal Tournament?
it is.
So it does reflect somewhat on our generation as well.
Yes, that is true. And you know what? It's funny that the engine that they used for Unreal Tournament is still being used by a lot of game publishers because they open source and license it as well. So a lot of people use that game engine to make different games.
Right.
So yeah, I'm glad you remembered that. That was a game that I have played in late 90s, I guess.
Yes, that's true. So Fortnite, what is it exactly? It's like their latest breakthrough product. It's been around for some time.
It's been around for some time. It's actually a shooter survival sort of open environment game,
Right.
and it just got a lot of traction because of a lot of I can remember like a lot of celebrities, young celebrities, athletes who are playing that game and even mimicking some of those moves from that games in their professional life. Like I'll give you an example. There are some well supported and well watched football players who are doing celebrations after scoring a goal, which resonate with Fortnite celebrations.
Oh, okay.
So it's getting sort of free marketing that way.
Right.
It's become really popular, and Epic obviously used that to raise some capital.
Right. So this is not an IPO. This is a private.
It's a private, and it's the biggest private raise for a video game company ever.
Right.
I think the previous one was about half of that, $500 million, I think, 550 million to be exact.
But is this like Fortnite is, I mean, I'm pretty sure we are beyond, I mean, let me sound even more dated. I'm pretty sure they don't sell like CDs, right? I mean, we are beyond that era.
Yeah, no, console games, I mean, you can buy digital copy as well for console games, but they did sell the actual copy of the game for, I think, $40 when they started. Okay. And then they made a strategic decision of making it free. And now the game is available for free. I think there's one on mobile.
But isn't that the direction where most video game publishers are now heading towards? Like they really don't monetize it at the point of sale.
Yes, some are. Like that's an interesting debate. There are a lot of games which are which still rely on that purchase price.
Right.
But like you said, there are a lot of simpler games which are using not that upfront price as their core monetization driver, but rather in-game purchases, like virtual items in-game, like newer weapons, newer maps, newer challenges. And that virtual currency is actually a function of real currency. So you got to buy those. And
so you basically improve your experience, you kind of level up, but you obviously spend money doing that.
Yes, and that's sort of, I think, their primary source. I think these guys, Epic, made about $1 billion in revenue from these virtual in-game sales.
Wow.
Last
so
year.
Is this also available on mobile? I mean, it has to be, right?
Yeah, yes, it is. I think Fortnite.
Because I think that kind of a dynamic where you play and I've often played games where they make you watch an ad.
Yeah.
Right? They don't charge you for the experience or they don't charge you for the game, but they make you watch an ad like within the environment.
Yeah.
And that's how they make money. So I think these are all also kind of, implications of like a mobile internet generation of gameplay.
Yeah. And that's very interesting. You say that it is true. And another little thing about here is how important, I mean, these guys say that continuous real-time data of user play, of gameplay is captured.
Right.
And it is used to drive the direction of the creativity of how the game should be made.
Right.
So they're actually real-time capturing data on what people are liking, what people are not liking, what weapons they're liking, and that continuously loops in. And so there is, you can argue that a little bit of creative liberty is taken away from game designers.
Right.
But
they're kind of crowdsourcing the game development process as well.
Yeah, by including more and more data. Right. So it's data is one of the most abused word I feel anyway. In the from everyone, more data. But yeah, this is an example where more data is being driven to drive creative direction of the games.
Right.
So
so you are the product. You say.
Yeah, but you don't know what the product is. It's you. Who's the product?
Right. Right. It's very interesting, and I think in terms of the dynamic of this, I mean, isn't it very different? Isn't it very similar to gambling slot machines? That kind of incremental kick you get while playing. Like you buy something, you get a better experience, and after some time you again buy it, and it kind of hooks you on. I mean, I think in slot machines also they kind of are designed that after every fifth or sixth roll you'll get some sort of a minimal payback to loop you back in.
Yeah, no, I like that analogy. And the house always wins.
Right, exactly. The house always wins. So maybe that's the case here as well. So yes, this is the end of our podcast this week, Sharad. Very, very wide variety of topics. We started with US midterms, then went to RBI and central banking, and ended up with Fortnite. Like, do we really have a target group of listeners? I doubt it.
I don't know. It's wider the better, I guess.
Yes.
But yeah, it was fun to be here as always.
Yes, it was. So, would like to remind our listeners that we are obviously streaming on Audio Boom. You can also find us on Spotify, Deezer, Google Podcast, iTunes. So, do subscribe, do like, do comment. Let us know your feedback if you can, improve these weekly podcasts. And yeah, this is Nikhil
And this is Sharath.
signing off.